The reading is from Jeremiah, verses 1 to 14. This is the text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders among the exiles, and to the priests, the prophets, and all the other people Nebuchadnezzar had carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. This was after King Jehoiakim and the Queen Mother, the court officials, and the leaders of Judah and Jerusalem, the craftsmen and the artisans, had gone into exile from Jerusalem. He entrusted the letter to Elasah, son of Shaphan, and to Gemariah, son of Hilkiah, whom Zedekiah, king of Judah, sent to King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. It said, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my gracious promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and to not harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back into the place from which I carried you into exile."
So good morning and welcome. Welcome to our Sunday morning service. Thank you to Marie for reading from Jeremiah 29. We've been looking at the God of hope in these unfamiliar times over the last few weeks. We've looked at the story of Noah, we've looked at Joseph, and then at the wanderings in the desert. We've looked at Ruth, and then last week we looked at the story of Job. The story that Marie read to you is a very familiar passage for many of us. It's actually brought some people to know Jesus and to follow him. It's spoken to others about words of encouragement and hope when they face difficult times. And God has used it to guide some people going forward. Yet this passage is set in the context of very unfamiliar times. The people of Judah had been taken into exile into Babylon by the king of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar. They're living in exile in Babylon where customs are different, the food is different, the gods are different. If you want to read a little bit more about it, then have a look at the beginning of the book of Daniel. Living there will be a challenge for them, to say the least. So how does this passage help us in our time? Well, as the people of Judah struggled to live in their time, so many of us are struggling to live in our time too. We may not be in a different land as they were in Babylon from Jerusalem, but nonetheless, it feels a bit strange out there when you can't walk up to your friends and hug them if they don't live in your household. You can't walk up even to your family who you don't live with and give them a hug. We have to stay socially distant from one another to keep each other safe and well. So things may be different to this story that we're reading, this letter that was written by Jeremiah to the exiles in Babylon. But nonetheless, I think we can get some things from it as we listen to the Lord and see where he is for these people. So where is God for these people in exile? And how can the God of then who is still the same today, be here for us? What can we learn? Well, at the start of the reading in verse 1, we read that the people were taken into exile by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon at the time. But then if we carry on reading and read from verse 4, we read that God carried them into exile. Who do we believe? Was it God? Was it Nebuchadnezzar? Well, maybe Nebuchadnezzar actually physically carried them into exile because to satisfy his own purposes for invading and conquering Judah and increasing his land and his influence. But God was there carrying them too. A bit like Joseph at the end of his life. We can read about his life at the end of Genesis. He reflects on all that has happened to him and the way that his brothers ill-treated him and sold him effectively into slavery. And he says to them, what you meant for harm, God used for good. And so although in one sense the people of Judah are at the mercy of King Nebuchadnezzar, God is with them. And as we face unfamiliar times, we need to know that God is with us too. But what else do we read in this letter that was written from Jeremiah to the people, the exiles in Babylon? And how might it help us as we live in unfamiliar times? Well, it says many things. The first thing that it says is build houses and settle down. Not just a couple of nights in a tent in this land, but make your home in this land. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Well, any of you who do gardening, and I know many of you have been doing a lot of gardening at the moment with extra time on your hands, know that it takes a long time to produce anything to eat. Some crops that you might plant 1 year and then harvest in harvest time the end of the next year. So it takes an investment. It takes time. And then it says marry and have children and grandchildren. Well, that's not just a few nights in a tent. Make this place your home. This place is going to be your home for the foreseeable future. And by having children and grandchildren, that means that they're going to grow in number. Don't just stagnate where you are. And then he talks about seeking the peace and prosperity of the city. Pray for it. Wow. God wants them to be a blessing where they are, here and now. This is not a temporary place for them. And as we continue to read, it would seem that there are some prophets around about at the time who are saying that this is a temporary sojourn for them. They won't be here for very long. But Jeremiah says, no. God will come and return you to your land, to your home, when 70 years is complete. 70 years is a lifetime. They will be there a while, and they need to adjust to being where they are. They need to settle down. They need to make it their home. For God's plans, it continues, are to prosper and not to harm, to give hope and to give a future. And sometimes they, as we do, have to go through hardships to come back to him, to experience him in a new way. As we saw with Job last week, through all his loss that he encountered, he then had a new encounter with God. As the weeks have passed in our current situation, it seems obvious to me that we are here for the long term. We're not going to be just broadcasting our services for the next couple of weeks. We're going to be here for a while. We're not going to be able to gather together for a while. That's my thought, given what I'm hearing on the news. And my daughter and I were reflecting just the other day about how when we watch TV or when we see movies made some years ago or even more recently, we are slightly startled and stop and think, this is obviously before coronavirus, because you can't meet in the streets and give each other a hug anymore. The streets of London and other cities around the world are not full of people and hustle and bustle. There are not large gatherings of people. Life is different. And so what does Jeremiah have to say into our situation? Well, we can be fearful of this time and rail against it, or we can settle into it. We spoke about that a few weeks ago, settling into a new rhythm, making this our home, doing the best we can. It's not ideal. No one wants to be here, but we have to do the best that we can. Not constantly wishing it was different. Paul talks about this in one of his letters in the New Testament. I've learnt to be content with plenty and with nothing. Are we content in the place that we are, where we are? We can rail against it, or we can grow in it. We can learn things about ourselves and about God. Just the other day on Facebook, I saw someone who was having trouble sleeping, had started listening to the beginning of Genesis, being read by David Suchet, and they got to the end of the first 10 chapters. I know some of you started reading the Bible, the whole of the Bible, and maybe using apps like the Bible in 1 year from Holy Trinity Brompton would be a good way to start. That's an audio app that you can download, and you can listen to it while you're in the shower or in the bath or getting ready for the day or sitting quietly. I think it's probably what it's intended for, but I do know people who have listened to it while they've been doing their ablutions in the morning. Or maybe doing the Bible course in your home. That's available from the Bible Society, a wonderful resource. As we understand the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and the breadth of wisdom that we gain from the Old Testament as well as the New. And so I think Jeremiah is calling us to settle down in these unfamiliar times into our lives. And we can grow in who we are in God. And we can remember that we don't do this on our own. Just as he carried the Jews into exile, he carries us too. As many of you know, while I was on sabbatical, we gained a border collie sheepdog puppy in our home. She is adorable, and it's fascinating watching her grow and learn. And last weekend I was cutting the grass with the lawnmower, and she became quite demented by the sound and the movement of the lawnmower. She kept barking ferociously at the lawnmower and then trying to nip its wheels, like she might nip a sheep that was getting out of line. Joel, my son, and I tried various things to calm her. I kept the mower still so that she could just experience the noise of it. But as soon as I started walking with it, she was off again, barking and nipping at its wheels. And then Joel called her over and she went and sat with him. And I just stood quietly. And then as soon as I started moving, off she came and barked and barked and barked. It was becoming intolerable. I couldn't really mow the lawn. But then Joel got up from where he was sitting and came and stood with her. He didn't even have to hold her. He just stood with her. And I carried on mowing the lawn, and she was calm. And that gave me a picture of what I think it was like for the people in exile, and what it's like for us. When we know that God is with us, we can face all these difficult things that are going on around us. God carried them into exile. He was with them. Nothing that was happening around them that was beyond his control or was bigger than him. And at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, we read Jesus' final words that Matthew recalls. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age. God was with the Jews in Babylon, carried into exile. Jesus promises that he will be with his disciples to the very end of the age, just before he ascends to heaven, as we celebrated this week on Thursday. And whatever we face in these unfamiliar times, the God of hope is with us. So we can settle down and we can grow, and knowing that God is with us. Amen.